Welcome to Nuances, Beyond First Impressions with the Asian Diaspora.
I'm Ariadna Milla, a Filipino-American from a small town on the southern border in Texas.
I'm Sherilyn Lee, a new American with Chinese Mauritian roots.
Together, we wanted to create a safe space where everyone feels welcome to learn more about the AAPI community.
We hope that through the personal stories we'll hear, we'll all get a glimpse of the humanity behind the stereotypes, how we have so much in common in some ways and so little in other ways.
If you enjoy our show, please consider leaving us a 5-star rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Audible, or Google. This would help us reach more people like you who will really appreciate our work. Before we talk to Dr. Chung-Fat-Yim, we'd like to define a few terms. Mauritian is the demonym for the people of Mauritius. Mauritius is a tiny tropical island about the size of Oahu, located east of Madagascar in the Indian Ocean. That's where I'm from. Creole is a language that develops from contact between two or more languages. The Mauritian Creole is derived mostly from French and English, with influences from Indian, Chinese, and African languages. Monolinguals are people who can only speak one language. Many people in the US are monolinguals. Bilinguals are fluent in 2 languages. Psycholinguistics studies the mental faculties involved in the perception, production, and acquisition of language. Weird samples, WERID, are made up of white, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic individuals. These samples are not representative of the world due to their lack of diversity, and academia is now actively trying to use samples that are not just weird samples.
Dr. Ashley Chung-Fat-Yim is currently a postdoctoral fellow in the Bilingualism and Psycholinguistics research group at Northwestern University. Her research focuses on the neural and cognitive consequences of bilingualism. During her PhD, she was awarded the ThinkSwiss Research Award and the Mitacs Globalink Research Award to conduct research abroad at the Institute of Multilingualism in Fribourg, Switzerland. Before her postdoctorate position at Northwestern University, Ashley earned her PhD from York University in psychology. Thank you so much for being here. We are really excited to have you. Sherry and I were looking through some of your papers, and oh my God, this looks so interesting.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. First and foremost, I just want to thank you both for bringing visibility to Asians. I think a lot about the quote that Margaret Cho has, which is the power of visibility can never be underestimated. So thank you both for what you're doing.
Thank you. We started chatting just because it's rare for us to find other creatives who are Asian.
Yeah. It's like latch on to each other.
Yeah.
When we first started and people were saying, I feel a bit lighter talking about this. And I think it's something that we've all carried with us on our own, but we've never had a space to be really candid about it.
I'm excited to have our first Mauritian on the show. Tell us a little bit about you and your experience growing up.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you mentioned Mauritian because I do feel a strong Mauritian identity, but I also am juggling these different identities. So there's the Canadian identity, there's the Mauritian identity, and there's also the Chinese identity as well, which to some extent I feel more distant. There's more distance with the Chinese identity just because growing up, as much as we tried to preserve the Chinese culture, I feel like the only real preservation that we had was with Chinese New Year. But aside from that, we didn't really follow many of the traditions. So I feel very strongly associated with my Mauritian culture, but not so much the Chinese culture. And part of me wonders, is it because of language? Because I never acquired Chinese. My grandfather was always like, learn Chinese. If you can learn another language, try to learn Hakka or something. And I never took it on. I think there's something so powerful about language too. It serves like a bridge connecting the individual to the community, because then you feel like you can actively participate in everything. What was really interesting is that because my parents moved from Mauritius to Canada, I'm actually born in Toronto, Canada. I think they wanted to integrate into the Canadian society so badly. I still maintain a number of Mauritian traditions, and we tried our best to attend as many activities that were organized by the Mauritian Association. But to be honest, I would say that I only really practice any kind of Mauritian traditions within the family unit, but I didn't feel like I really belonged in the community.
I get what you're saying, because I think most of my cousins who are in Toronto as well, who were born and grew up there, probably feel the same way because it's a secondhand culture that you don't experience on the daily. You have your family's idea of what it means to be Mauritian, but then outside, you don't really have any way to connect with other people like that. And then the side about Chinese culture too is because we're Chinese diaspora in Mauritius, and then your parents moved from Mauritius and they became the Mauritian diaspora in Toronto. So the Chinese is several steps removed from where you are.
Yeah, that's true. And then I think because I wasn't as proficient in Creole, although a lot of people were quite impressed to know that, oh, you speak Mauritian Creole even though you're born in Toronto. That's so great that your parents instilled that in you. But I always felt a little bit uncomfortable speaking to other Mauritians because I didn't quite feel like I belonged because I couldn't keep up with their conversation. So it's been interesting trying to navigate my Mauritian identity as well.
Yeah, a lot of my cousins who grew up in Canada, they can speak Creole, but they're more comfortable speaking English. Maybe it's being self-conscious about the accent or something, but yeah.
Definitely. And unfortunately, I will never sound like a native speaker because of the fact that I'm juggling these multiple languages. But yeah.
Do you feel like people expect you to, though?
Yes, I feel the pressure. I don't know if other people are actually expecting that of me, but I definitely feel the pressure.
I don't think people expect you to have native Mauritian accent. I think people are just happy that you speak.
That's good to know. I'll keep practicing.
So growing up, did your parents speak Creole to you at home or did you speak English?
A little bit of both. So my journey is a little bit interesting. Earlier on, it was strictly Creole, but they were also developing English because we were in an Anglophone community in Toronto. And then they enrolled me in a French-only school. So for a while, it was predominantly just French and Creole. And then afterwards, we made the shift to all English school in grade 7. So that's when we started integrating. English was always part of that, but I know my parents really wanted to improve their English. So at times I would respond back in Creole, but then also there were moments where I would respond in English just because it was the language that I was becoming more proficient in and more dominant. And I just preferred using it. So I would oftentimes just respond in English. I tried my best to maintain the Mauritian Creole, though.
From what I remember, your Creole was really good.
I liked it because I liked going to the mall and having secret language almost where you can talk about people and they wouldn't understand. So I definitely felt very proud to be Mauritian. People are always curious. They're like, I hear a bit of French, but it's not quite French. And I love to use any opportunity I can to showcase what Mauritius is. Yeah.
I like to confuse people and say I'm African when they ask where I'm from. What was it like with family expectations for you? How important are family expectations and how did cultural differences affect that with your family?
I feel like all Asian families feel this, where you have to be studious, make sure you pick a good career. Doctor and lawyer was always in the books, but I was very interested in psychology and the brain. Initially wanted to be a pharmacist. There was that expectation where you had to have a really good job and more motivated by career aspirations and things like that. The other thing that was always instilled in my family was the value of hard work. My dad, to this day, still works 2 jobs. He doesn't need to. I keep telling him, you should retire at this point, enjoy life.
Yeah.
But to this day, still works 2 jobs and he enjoys it. And I felt because they sacrificed so much coming to Canada and trying to provide us with a better life, I felt like I owed them that as well in return. So I wanted to also pick something that they would be proud of. So there's that kind of family expectations. And the other side of it, which I don't know whether or not it's very cultural, but I know my parents were the type to say, okay, try not to inconvenience other people. So I was never really allowed to sleep over at friends' places because they were like, let's not inconvenience their family, even though it was the parents that were like, bring Ashley over. So I don't know if these things parallel with you guys and your experiences growing up, but those were the 3 things that really struck out to me. It's like the value of hard work, the value of education, and try not to be in anyone's hair.
I feel like those are very Asian things.
Yeah.
Especially pick a career where you pay it forward with your parents. I don't know if this is a hot take, but it took me a really long time to get into my head that I don't owe my parents. I don't owe them my career. I don't owe them something they can be proud of. They chose to have me. I didn't ask to be born because I had the same thing. I was like, I should pick something that they're going to feel proud telling their friends, or pick something where I can pay them back for those sacrifices. And while I acknowledge and appreciate what they've done for me, that was their job. If I chose to have my own kids, I'm not going to expect them to pay me back for raising them.
That's true.
Yeah.
Do you find that they've changed over time?
I think so. I think the longer they've been here, less things get lost in translation because English is not their first language, but it's my first language. And I think they've just mellowed out now that I am making my own money.
Yeah. I feel the same way too. There's less pressure now. And I think at the beginning, because they were working so hard to make sure that they can provide you with a good life, that they were always very stressed out.
Yeah.
So they just wanted to make sure that they're giving you everything possible in order for you to be ready for the future. But now I feel like there's a bit of a shift where they're like, I just want you to be happy.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the pandemic, but I really feel like that's what they say. And I think the separation also, because now that I'm in Chicago and I'm further away from them, it's a lot of, we miss you, please come back. We just want you to be happy. If this is what makes you happy, then okay.
Other Asian diaspora people that I've spoken with, when they move away from home, that helps the relationship a lot too.
Yeah, and I think also when you're away, there's less control, but also less responsibility for them. You're on your own, so they can't protect you from everything. They just have to accept that, okay, she's old enough to take care of herself and she knows what she's doing.
A really interesting thing you brought up about protecting you, because I felt very strongly about that with my mom, where she checks in on me all the time and she just wants to protect me. But at some point you need to let go.
Yeah, it's hard for them to stop doing that because we're always going to be their babies.
It's true.
I think at some point too, it becomes less about them protecting us and more for their own peace of mind. When I first had graduated from college, I was living on my own. My mom was always like, I want you to text me when you're leaving to go to work, when you get to work, when you're leaving work, when you come back home from work. And just so that I know you're safe. And I understand why you want to know that, but at some point you have to trust. And who are you really doing this for? I think it's more for your own peace of mind. And so there's that letting go, like you were saying, that parents have to do at some point.
Yeah, moving away definitely forces that. Because for me, they're 12 hours ahead. If I text them anytime during the day, they're sleeping. They can't do anything.
And it's so funny that when they come to visit you, it's always the same thing where they're like, I'm going to cook for you. That's how they're showing their love. It's cook for you. I'll clean your plate. And I'm just like, no, I can do this.
I know. But if it's not exactly how they would do it, nope, I'm going to just do it. I'm going to fix everything.
Exactly.
Yeah, for me, when I go back, I almost feel bad because they'll just go out of their way to try and make everything perfect. And I'm like, just relax. But my mom will cook everything that I like to eat. And I'm like, don't tire yourself out. But she's so excited. Do you feel like you had a point where your English took over and you had some sort of language barrier between you and your parents? Because at first you were speaking Creole and French mostly, and then eventually switched to English being your dominant language. Was that a weird thing?
Personally, I would say that it was not. Just because, like I was mentioning before, my parents were trying to learn English. We're taking on all these opportunities to improve their English. So I would say that there wasn't as much of a language barrier, but I could see how it would be difficult in other families who they only speak the heritage language at home. And then the child goes on to become more dominant in the language of the community. And I can see how there would be a disconnect, even at the cultural level too, that they would identify more with their American identity and lose a little bit of their like heritage culture. But growing up, I didn't feel that way. And I strongly think the reason is because they wanted to integrate into Canadian society. So they would send us to skating lesson and try to do all the Canadian things.
Yeah. In terms of your neighborhood where you were growing up, it was pretty diverse, right? Scarborough was pretty diverse. So did you ever feel singled out or anything?
Scarborough was really diverse. And within the neighborhood I was living in, it was very diverse too. I would say I felt more singled out at school, even in the French-only school, because there weren't as many Asians speaking French. The other Asian person that was in my class was actually Mauritian. So there is that aspect. But aside from that, there wasn't a Chinese person, for example. So I didn't have that many friends that were Asian growing up, I would say. Actually, now that I think about it, I didn't have that many friends that were Asian in my childhood. Even when I switched to an English school, my friends were predominantly Caucasian or like a mixture of different, but they weren't like predominantly Asian until I went into high school, which is interesting. I kind of gravitated more towards finding like an Asian group, and I felt very comfortable within that group. So I guess, yeah, growing up, I felt left out and certainly because I didn't see as many people like me. And within my actual neighborhood, it was pretty diverse, but not in terms of like school.
Yeah. Did the kids ever pick on you for being different or make fun of your food or anything like that?
No, I didn't get picked on or I wasn't discriminated against in school. I was pretty lucky, I guess. It was a small class too.
Yeah.
There was only 13 people.
Wow.
Yeah. So I didn't feel singled out or anything.
That's pretty cool.
That's nice to hear because I feel like when we ask other guests that question, they have these stories of just the kids being really mean. So it's nice to hear that there are places where we don't feel singled out in a bad way or we don't feel discriminated against.
And I think part of the reason is because Canada is pretty multicultural and there's multilingualism as well. And the fact that I was going to a French school alone, like those parents, their perception of bilingualism, they're more open-minded, I would say. So as a result, I think the kids there are also raised differently or more aware that there's all these different cultures out there. Because even for them, some of them were from Quebec, other people were from Egypt, or some were from France. So they had their own cultures that they were bringing. So I didn't feel like I was left out.
Yeah.
Growing up, I wasn't really made aware of how distinct I was being Asian. But moving to the United States, despite being in Chicago, which is a big city, I am very much aware of the fact that I am Asian. Not so much on campus, but in my neighborhood right now, I don't see that many people that look like me. So that's been interesting, coming here and being very much aware that I'm a minority.
Yeah, I definitely felt that when I moved to the US as well. Even though I was in Silicon Valley, which is one of the most diverse places in the US, the workplace, it was diverse, but it was more white than I was used to. And then with the last few years, everything that's happened, George Floyd and Stop Asian Hate, I now feel acutely aware of being Asian, whereas when I was in Toronto, that never even crossed my mind. And we never felt like it was not safe to just walk around and do your groceries. But yeah, apart from your neighborhood, how did you realize that something is different?
Honestly, just walking around the community and just doing everyday activities, I just had a moment where it hit me like, wow, this is so different from Toronto.
Yeah.
Where when you step out of your door, you are guaranteed almost to bump into someone who is Asian. As for here, you need to search for them. I was very much made aware that I feel very much a minority here.
Yeah. And how about in your career? Do you feel like your ethnicity has played a role in how you're perceived and what opportunities you get, how you're compensated, that kind of stuff?
In terms of my career, perhaps there were some discrimination, but I'm not entirely sure. Perhaps it's microaggressions, who knows? I do know that my last name in publications is pretty distinct because it's Chung-Fat-Yim, and sometimes it works against me in a way, and I can give you an example. Oftentimes when papers will cite me, they won't put my full last name. They'll just put Chung, or they'll take Yim, like the last part of it, and that ends up working against me because I don't get cited because they're not able to link the two. But I felt very strongly about keeping all three parts of my last name because in academia, it's really important to be identified, essentially. And I feel very proud of my Mauritian culture that I've never wanted to lose any parts of it. I pretty much from the beginning was like, even if I were to get married, I would maintain the three parts to my last name. So yeah, in that sense, I felt like I've been discriminated against potentially, but it's interesting. Eventually, I'd like to become a professor. And in terms of that whole landscape, it's very much Caucasian, tends to be male, like all of these things. So I don't really see people like me in higher up positions. And that's where I see a little bit more of the discrimination. My old lab, there weren't as many Asian grad students, but there were females because psychology, there are more females than males. But now in my new lab at Northwestern, there's 4 or 5 females who are Asian. So it's a stark difference from before where only 2 of us were Asian and in a large lab. And then now it's a whole shift to all being predominantly majority female and Asian.
Have you had any stereotypes or anything that you had to navigate?
The stereotypes that I had to deal with are more gender related than being Asian. I've had situations in the past where I've pitched an idea for something. And then the person who I was pitching the idea to will say, oh, no, this isn't a good idea. And then I would share the idea to another colleague who happens to be male. And that person will pitch the idea and it'll be like, oh, this is the best idea ever. And I'm like, but you just heard it from me. So it's these little things like that where I feel the injustice more in terms of being female rather than being Asian. But I don't know. Nobody has blatantly said anything to discriminate against me for being Asian. I also work in a bilingualism lab. So it
would be pretty ironic.
Yeah. It's hard to not be open to these other cultures and experiences and language experiences. So I know a lot of people are very fascinated by the fact that I was Mauritian and they can say, oh, I know a Mauritian person. So they were proud and really interested in my culture.
Tell us a bit about how you got into this field. What sparked your interest to get into that?
Yeah, in high school, like I said, I wanted to become a pharmacist. And then afterwards, I started taking more classes in sociology and psychology. And I realized I'm just so passionate. Like every time I would read the papers, I had more questions. And it just intrigued me so much that I was like, okay, for grad school, let's just apply to psychology. So I did, and I picked it. Throughout undergrad, I was actually primarily doing vision research. So looking at the effects of motion parallax, looking at depth perception, and all of these things. It was throughout my entire undergrad until fourth year. I even did my honors thesis in vision research, but I remember being very unhappy. I would read the papers and I wouldn't feel inspired. At the same time, I was taking courses in educational psychology and cognition and psycholinguistics. And I was like, wow, I love language. And I wanted to learn more about myself. So I felt like I was more of a unique case because my journey was that I was fluent in multiple languages, but then as a result of not using them as often, I ended up losing a bit of my French, losing a bit of my Creole as well. So I wonder what's happening in the brain. These things are disappearing. And also I was always fascinated by the fact that Mauritian Creole wasn't exactly a formal language. There's no written system to it. I wonder if there's a difference between learning languages that have literacy involved versus those that are just more of a spoken language and a language of the community. So all of these things inspired me to do research on bilingualism. And I ended up applying to Ellen Bialystok's lab. And yeah, it's been such a journey and I've loved every minute of it. I feel like there's so much to explore still.
Yeah, just going through your list of papers, they all sound so interesting.
Yeah, because Sherry and I are thinking about our bilingualism and what's going on in our brains for that. I don't feel totally comfortable saying Spanish is my third language because I'm conversational, but I don't know that I could do a podcast in Spanish. But if I go for a really long time without speaking it, and if there's nothing that I'm watching that's in Spanish, I lose it. I don't use it in my everyday life because I speak Taglish with my parents and I speak English with my friends. There's not really a lot of places where I use Spanish. So then I just lose it and I have to catch up when I do want to start speaking it. It's interesting to wonder what goes on with that.
I was interested to hear, because you mentioned Tagalog. Do you find that you're having to have the two different identities or code switching almost?
It's interesting because when I'm speaking in Tagalog and I sometimes use English words, I say them with a Tagalog accent.
Ah, yeah. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. So there definitely is a code switching going on.
Yeah, I feel like that happens with me too. When I'm speaking English, it gets very confusing when I have my parents and my husband in the same room and they're all speaking English. I feel like when I'm speaking to Mauritians, I have a Mauritian accent. And then when I'm speaking with Americans, I have an American accent. And then when they're all in the same room, my brain's like, I don't know what to do.
But then with your parents, do you speak predominantly Mauritian or do you?
Yeah, usually I'll speak Creole unless there's English speakers in the room, then I will speak English. But then sometimes I can think of it in Creole, but I can't think of it in English right now.
Yeah, it's actually really fascinating. There's something known as cultural frame switching, where bicultural bilinguals can actually access the different mental schemas that are related to each culture. So if you're having East-West culture, like a Chinese English bilingual, they can access the mental models that are associated with that culture and actually exhibit those behaviors that align with that culture. So it's like if you have two different identities and you can switch between identities and exhibit the behaviors that are culturally relevant in that particular situation just by being primed in that language. That's why you're saying that when you have both, you're primed with both. You don't know what to do.
Yeah, something in there goes, what? Which one do I go? Where do I go?
Yeah, which one do you access and what behavior do I exhibit?
Yeah, I've noticed that every time I go back, I have people speaking Creole and then people speaking English to me in a Mauritian accent, and then my husband speaking English to me in an American accent, and it's all jumbled up in my head. We want to talk a little bit about some of the fascinating stuff you've been working on. Tell us a bit more about how the brain is affected by language and specifically bilingualism. And there's so much cool stuff.
Yeah. So one of the most interesting findings in psycholinguistics research is that a bilingual brain, it's not like you're switching off a language. So it's not like an on and off switch. So every time you see something, for example, if you see a dog and you're French English bilingual, your brain will label it as dog and chien automatically. So you have to somehow inhibit the irrelevant language. So as I'm using English right now, my French is activated as well. My Creole is also activated, but I have to focus on English. And it's kind of like a spotlight effect where your attention needs to focus on English, but these ones are still there, but the spotlight is on English. So because your brain has been trained in doing this your entire life, it has actually developed these areas of the brain known as the executive functions. This frontal area of the brain has become more efficient at processing these kind of scenarios that are not necessarily linguistic. It can be even on these nonverbal tasks that bilinguals tend to do better on. And I can give you an example of a task that we use in our research. It's known as the Stroop task. There's something called the Stroop effect. It's really neat. Your task is to name the color of the ink. You have color names that are printed, and they can be printed in either the same color as the color name, or it's in a different color. But your goal is to actually name the color of the ink. So you have to override reading the actual word. And bilinguals do better on this task. They're more accurate on this task than monolinguals, because their whole life they had to juggle these multiple languages and they had to focus on the task itself, which is, for me, speak English right now. That's the goal. Similar to the Stroop task, where the goal is to name the color of the ink. Disregard the reading. Don't even pay attention to that, which is really difficult because reading is so automatic. So we use these different types of executive control tasks to look at executive functioning and how bilinguals will process this kind of information compared to monolinguals. Yeah.
That's fascinating.
When you mentioned the spotlight going on, is there a difference if you have a language that's your dominant one? Does that still happen with your secondary languages? I don't know that I learned Tagalog and English concurrently. I learned one first.
It does, as long as you've reached a certain level of fluency in your second language. That question has to do with the age of second language acquisition. But I always say that it doesn't matter at what age you learn a second language, you can always reap the benefits. It's really how often you use it and how much practice and how fluent you are. But as being bilingual or trilingual, there are so many factors because, like I said, proficiency is one. There's also age of acquisition. There's also who do you use it with, in what context. There's so many variables to keep track of. But as long as you're practicing and using it on a daily basis and you feel like you've attained a certain level of fluency, then we would consider you bilingual. Yeah. And you would still reap those cognitive benefits.
That's so cool.
When you're looking at bilingual brains and monolingual brains, are there structural differences because of that?
Yeah. So the whole process of learning a second language, when you're becoming fluent in a second language, the areas of the brain that are associated with language processing actually become bigger. So they grow in volume. When I talk about gray matter versus white matter, I like to use the analogy of the subway stations being gray matter and the subway tunnels being white matter. In both cases, bilingualism has been shown to lead to better gray matter volume. Think about the subway stations actually becoming bigger. And white matter increases connectivity between those stations. Essentially, you're increasing efficiency of how fast information is being transmitted from one brain region to the other and preserving the integrity. So the information is faster, more efficient, and you're also building new connections, which is cool. So you're finding these shortcuts between brain regions. All of these things happen as a result of being bilingual. It's like you're training your brain.
Yeah. Does that affect memory and how much information you can retain?
Well, Not so much memory per se. In terms of task, we tend to find that they do better on something known as working memory. So having to update information, but not necessarily that they're better at remembering information. We haven't found evidence that they're better in terms of just memory alone. But the process of having to manipulate information, known as working memory, they tend to be better at that. But one of the things with regards to the connections and having this larger brain region is that you're able to do more, you're able to process information faster. And we see that even with EEG studies. EEG tells you the timing of exactly when a cognitive process occurs. And through my research, I've shown that bilinguals' cognitive components tend to occur earlier than monolinguals. So they're processing information faster than monolinguals. It's really neat.
I saw that you also had some paper about how it affects attention.
Yeah, we've talked about executive functions as being multiple different things. I like to call executive functions the CEO of the brain. It's vital for a lot of things, including decision making in terms of reaching your goals, things like that. Attention plays a large part of that. Think about spotlight effect. So bilingualism has an effect on what you're attending to in the environment. You have to deal with a very linguistically complex environment. Navigating all of that is a lot. You've had to figure out some kind of solution or strategy in order to be efficient at taking in all of this information. The most striking evidence of this is with infants who are unable to produce language yet, but they were raised in a bilingual environment. A bilingual environment meaning that the parents speak a different language, they each speak different languages, or they have a caregiver that also speaks a different language, versus a monolingual environment, which strictly speaks one language. There are studies to show that infants raised in a bilingual environment are better at noticing changes, even though they're infants. Nobody is like, hey, there's a change that happened, but they're better able to detect the change. They're able to detect a language switch based off of just visual information, which is really neat. So yeah, and these are infants that can't produce the language yet. So there's something happening at the attentional level that they're taking in information differently than monolinguals.
That is so cool.
Yeah.
How do you measure the attention of an infant?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it has to do with the paradigms that you build. Typically, you present them with the same thing over and over again. And it's usually eye tracking that they measure. So there's different paradigms you can use. Some of them are habituation, where you keep showing them the same thing over and over again until they're completely disengaged because they're like, I've seen this, I'm over it. But then you show them something new and they look at it again because it's interesting. Bilingual infants reach that point faster. They're able to detect that change right away compared to monolingual infants. Yeah, so eye tracking is a really powerful tool with infants because they can't press the button. Yeah. They can't tell you what they're doing or what they're seeing.
That is so cool.
Yeah.
So is it possible to have two mother tongues?
I would say so, especially if you have two parents that speak different languages and they speak to you in it since you're little. I believe, yeah, you can have two mother tongues.
And I think I saw something in your research about how we might process things differently in our mother tongue versus a secondary language.
Yeah, so there's a lot of research on that, and it's really fascinating. It's known as the foreign language effect. Essentially, a lot of this research has shown that when you're processing information in your second language, it tends to be more emotionally distant. My colleagues, Yuri Hayakawa and Viorika Marian at Northwestern, they've done their own research on this. So this is with sequential bilinguals. So bilinguals who learned a second language after their first one. It tends to be more emotionally distant. One of the hypotheses being that because you learned your second language in more of a formal context at school, that it's less emotionally charged compared to in the home context. There's some really fascinating research looking at Harry Potter, reading Harry Potter in your native language versus your non-native language. And they actually found that the areas of the brain that is involved in emotion processing, that when you're reading Harry Potter in your non-native language, so in your second language, it tends to be less activated in comparison to your native language. There's been some really cool research using different methodologies to show that, yeah, you definitely do process information in your second language differently than your first language. And even in terms of retrieving memories, autobiographical memories, making decisions, there's differences there as well.
Yeah.
Really neat.
So if you're making a decision, you should make it in their second language. You'd be more objective.
Yeah. My other friends who are multilingual, some of them translate everything in their head. So they'll think it in their first language, then translate it, then speak it. Others, it's more on par with the first language where they can think in that language. Does that relate to the detachment?
Part of it. Because you have to take that extra step to translate it. Yeah, that's part of it too. One of the hypotheses is that's the reason why it's more emotionally distant.
Yeah.
That is so cool. And then your most recent paper is on cultural diversity and ethnic minority psychology and how our cultural background can influence our emotion perception. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, it's about emotion perception and multisensory emotion perception. What that means is that emotions are conveyed not just through your facial expressions, which is the visual modality, but it's also conveyed through your tone of voice, through the auditory modality. So it's looking at the simultaneous presentation of both. And the way that multisensory emotion perception is studied is you'll pair two different emotions. One modality will be a happy voice paired with a sad face. Cross-cultural research has shown that individuals who are from Eastern cultures tend to rely more on the information from the auditory modality. Individuals from Western societies rely more on information from the facial expressions. And we've been getting these papers out, but we've looked at bilinguals in Singapore, having multiple different cultures, pitting the East and West. We've also looked at bicultural bilinguals who recently immigrated from China to the United States. How would they perceive multisensory emotion perception? And the results have been really fascinating. There's differences between whether or not they immersed in United States early versus later. The percentage of daily exposure to Western culture has an impact as well. So yeah, it's been really interesting to see that there are these cultural differences that exist in multisensory emotion perception based off of just display rules. It has been proposed by other authors that the reason why Western individuals tends to focus more on facial expressions is because they're always told be very direct with your information. You tend to put yourself first before others, that the most explicit way to exert power, exert some kind of influence is through your facial expressions. As for more Eastern individuals, because they tend to prioritize the needs of others over themselves, they tend to rely more on the subtle auditory modality in order to express their emotions. So it's been really neat to see that there's this intersection between language and culture and emotion processing.
Does tonal language make a difference? Because you have to be very good at detecting tones if you're speaking a tonal language, which in English you really don't have to. Could that be part of the reason?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating point. I think that's the next step because this is still a recent research, I would say, from 2015. And it's only a handful of studies that have looked at cross-cultural differences in multisensory emotion perception. So I would say that's definitely something that would be interesting to look at. A language that's not tonal, like Korean, that is still in the Eastern society, but doesn't have the tonal part. Yeah, that would be really neat to do future research.
I've also noticed that for me, the way I learned to have an American accent, I learned from the tones, the melody of how people speak. And I've noticed that different curves of how people speak mean different things in different languages. I know that I've noticed sometimes when either my parents would say something or my husband would say something that I would think, in the other language, that would be interpreted differently, just the tone of it. One example is in Creole at home, things are said more like do this or do that.
Very direct.
It's very go do this. And it's not meant to be I'm ordering you to do this. That's just how we speak. But if you just translated that directly to English and you say do that, that would sound like you're ordering somebody to do it. And I noticed that when I last went to Mauritius, where when they said that to me, it came off to me like they were bossing me around. No, that's how they always speak. I just got used to the American way of speaking.
That's so interesting. Sometimes via text, my parents will say something to me and I'm like, that seems rude. I wonder if they're upset. And then I'll talk to my mom on the phone. She's perfectly happy. And I'm like, what was the message? And she's like, that's just how we talk in Creole. And I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah, that definitely happens. Has it been harder to get research for minority psychology, or is it the hot field now?
I would say the field is moving towards that in terms of having greater appreciation for diversity, moving away from what we call the non-weird sample. So weird being Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, trying to move away from those samples because inclusivity is really important and generalizability as well. Unfortunately, 90% of published studies are on these weird samples. So there's definitely a push towards non-weird sample and just diversity in general. And I've noticed with regards to even conference fees that they say that if you're from these countries, that you could either get a discount or your fee is waived. So there's definitely some things happening in the field that's pushing towards diversity, but I think we still have a long way to go, unfortunately.
Yeah, because I was looking at your papers and I was looking into that field in general, and I couldn't find anything earlier than 2010-ish. Yeah, so it's fascinating. I can't wait to see what else you guys find out.
Yeah. And interesting because I was working on the grant process slides for the conference at APS, and I did come across a lot of grants that were for women in science, but not as much about Asian. And I would have liked to see that more so I could provide that information to graduate students. But unfortunately, I didn't find as many. So that's something too to fund this kind of research.
Yeah, we need more interesting studies. This is so cool because a lot of our podcasts, we process our collective Asian experience and a lot of things are not that pleasant, but it's good to know that we have an advantage.
So many benefits.
I don't know if you or Sherry, have you had this experience? Sometimes I mix up Spanish and Tagalog and I'll say the wrong word. Does that happen to either of you guys?
Yes. It's very strategic too sometimes. I also find sometimes I have a tip of the tongue experience where I'm trying to retrieve the word and it's not coming to me. So then I just default to the other language.
I've had a lot of times when I'm speaking with my husband and he doesn't speak Creole and all I can think of is the Creole word.
Yeah, that definitely happens to me.
Dr. Medina on TikTok talks about how when you're a kid and you're learning Spanish, saber is the infinitive form for to know in Spanish. And a lot of kids, when they want to say, I don't know, they'll say no sabo instead of no sé because they're trying to copy the pattern of the way it's conjugated, even though it's irregularly conjugated. And he says that's actually a good thing when you get those confused because it's your brain working. Instead of compartmentalizing a language as it's this repository of words that you have at your disposal. So even if you speak Taglish or Spanglish, and you mix in words from different languages, you're using all of these different repositories of words that you have in your brain.
It's so neat. The two languages are completely integrated with one another and they influence each other too.
Yeah.
So that's the really fascinating research that's been coming out for a while now, but how one language will impact the other language and how you process information in that other language. So it's been really neat. In the lab that I work in right now, she does a lot of research on how cross-linguistic activation occurs and how it impacts memory and different things.
Yeah, I remember being a kid and my mom and my grandma would speak Hakka between them, but they would never speak just Hakka. There was always some Creole mixed in. And so I ended up getting to a point where I could understand what they were saying. I didn't understand everything, but I could always figure out what they were talking about. And then one time they said something in the car and I burst out laughing and they're like, "You understood that?" I couldn't speak, but I can tell what they're talking about most of the time, even though if you ask me what the word is, I probably couldn't remember. I wish that I had stuck with Mandarin lessons when I was a kid, but at the same time, I would probably have lost it because I didn't have any place to practice.
Do you think you would have probably tried to seek out opportunities to preserve it?
I don't know, because I think at the time, because it was something that was forced on me, I hated it. And I was trying so hard to get away from it till I moved to North America and people started approaching me assuming that I speak the language. I never felt like I should. I was comfortable just being a Mauritian Chinese who doesn't speak any Asian language because most of our generation does not. But here, I just feel weird about it. I'm the only Asian people know that doesn't speak any Asian language, apparently.
I felt similarly about learning Tagalog, where I was very ambivalent about it. And I was like, why? I'm trying to think back on what did I feel when I was learning Tagalog and why did I learn it? And I can't remember if I actually wanted to learn. I think I just eventually picked it up because of my family. I remember my grandma would force me to talk to her in Tagalog. and she would pretend not to understand me if I would speak to her in English. I think it wasn't until I got older where I actually had the desire to learn other languages, and I was like, oh, I'm relieved that I know Tagalog because most of my cousins don't speak it. But
yeah, it's interesting how as you grow older, you're like, oh, I value this so much more now. And even Sherilyn, how you were saying that you associated Mandarin, you just hated it because you're so associated with taking classes and all that. It's funny how language can carry so much baggage and weight.
Yeah. I went on a trip to Taiwan when I was 15 or so. It was interesting how quickly the Mandarin that I learned in school came back. I couldn't write to save my life, but I remembered the words and I could retrieve all the words that I had learned when I was 5 to 8 years old. If people learn a language from Duolingo, do you think that they will get the benefits of bilingualism at some point, or is that not enough? Do you need more formal training?
Duolingo is a great tool. And actually a recent study came out. One of the authors is actually my former PhD supervisor, and it's with older adults, which is even more neat. They're all monolinguals. None of them had learned a second language, but there are 3 groups. One of them being a monolingual passive control group, because you always need some kind of control group. The second group, they were learning Duolingo. I believe they were learning Spanish. And then the third group, they were engaging in these brain training exercises. So these were intense brain training exercises that they would do. And on executive control tasks, the Duolingo group and the brain training group, they actually improved in their executive control abilities. But the monolinguals that were in the passive group, the control group, they stayed the same. And like I said, these are with older adults. So at any age, you could learn second language. You just won't reach that native proficiency and being able to have the native accent. But yeah, you can reap the benefits at any age. It's great.
That is cool. Yeah, my mom is using Duolingo.
Oh yeah, that's great.
Yeah, she's been doing Italian and she's had, I don't know, an 800-day streak or something. She's really serious about it. Yeah. So I think she's very excited to hear that's helping her brain. To end the interview, we have a few rapid fire questions that we ask guests.
What was the first language you learned?
I would say Creole.
What language do you speak with your parents?
English.
What's an Asian food that you should like but don't?
Oh gosh. Okay. This is a little controversial because I'm Mauritian. And I should like spicy food because Mauritian food is integrating Indian and there's Chinese influence and everything. And for the life of me, I can't enjoy spicy food. So I would say spicy food. I'm very sorry. I've disappointed many Mauritian people.
I don't eat pima either.
And what's an Asian food that you'll never get tired of?
There's sushi, there's soup dumplings, there's so many things. Asian food is so good.
What is your favorite paper that you wrote?
I actually really like the paper I wrote that's on narrative transportation. This ability to transport into the fictional world that the writer created and comparing bilinguals using their native language versus non-native language. I had a lot of fun writing that.
Oh, talk a bit about that. So what's the difference between...
Oh, we didn't find any differences between group and ethnicity, which is great actually, because it goes to show that even if you're using your second language, you can still connect with the characters. You can still feel immersed in the storyline. Yeah.
I recently started watching Who Killed Sarah, and I was like, this time I'm going to use Spanish subtitles. And I never dub anything. I just use English subtitles if it's another language. And I was really nervous that I wouldn't understand what was going on, but I still did, even if there were things that I would miss when they were speaking. So it's interesting that I found that was the case. I still understood the story and cared about the characters.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. I also want to know if you could learn any other language that you don't already know, which one would it be?
I would love to learn Japanese just because I really want to go back and immerse in that culture. I find it so fascinating. It would be great to being able to connect with the locals. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. It was so interesting to hear about all your research.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
And it's great seeing you again after I don't know how many years.
I know, it's been a really long time. It's really nice to reunite.
For the listeners who are interested to learn more about language and how that influences the brain and your behavior, I would highly recommend checking out my supervisor's book that is coming out next year. It's called The Power of Language by Dr. Viorica Marian. So just keep an eye out for that.
Here are our takeaways from today's episode. Number 1. Many immigrants pride themselves on working hard, contributing to their adopted country, and assimilating to the best of their ability. Number 2, when we move out, our parents can't be responsible for our safety and success anymore. This sometimes helps them relax and shift into a more supportive role rather than actively worrying 24/7. Number 3, we can't always articulate our need for diversity. Even though Dr. Chung-Fat-Yim never experienced overt racism, moving to a school with more Asian kids was a welcome change. Number 4, both Dr. Chung-Fat-Yim and Sherry feel that moving to the US made them more aware of their Asianness and their status as a minority. Number 5, sexism is alive and well in academia. If you see your female colleagues' ideas get shot down, then applauded when coming from a male, speak up and give the female colleague due credit. Number 6, cross-linguistic and cross-cultural research is driven by questions posed by people like Dr. Chung-Fat-Yim, whose unique background helped identify gaps in psycholinguistics that are only beginning to be filled. Number 7, in a bilingual brain, there isn't a switch to use one language or the other. Rather, every language is activated at the same time, and we have to inhibit all of them except the one we want to use. Number 8, bilinguals' language processing areas of the brain develop more gray matter and white matter. This translates to better performance on both linguistic and non-linguistic tasks. Bilinguals also process some information faster than monolinguals and can be observed even in infants who have not yet acquired language but who live in a bilingual household. Number 9, some cultures place more emphasis on the tone of voice to detect or express emotions, while others rely more on facial expression. Number 10, it does not matter at what age you start learning a language, you can reap the benefits of bilingualism as long as you keep practicing and maintain fluency. Number 11, using the Duolingo app is as effective as doing brain training exercises and leads to improvements in performance in older adults. And number 12, if you learn a new language later in life, you experience the foreign language effect, where you process things with more emotional distance in the new language than in your native tongue.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation and tune in next week for another nuanced conversation.